This episode explores a topic many avoid, but all are touched by narcissism. Not as a label, but as a doorway. Today's conversation invites a deeper look at ego, empathy, and how confronting narcissism can unexpectedly become a catalyst for spiritual awakening and personal growth. This is Mind Over Matter, and I'm your host, Anya. Welcome to the show, Sterlin. It's such an honor to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Mhm. So, you suggest that narcissism isn't just something to escape, but something to understand. What's the first misunderstanding people have about it?
Yeah, I think for me, the first misunderstanding is that narcissism um, is not the entirety of a person. Of course, it's a defense strategy that people use or employ due to various reasons, whether it's genetic upbringing, environment, all of those things come together to create narcissism. But I think especially relevant to our conversation today, thinking about narcissism in terms of just a defense strategy that a human being uses kind of can help to both, um, to some extent, humanize the narcissists themselves and also um, help people to understand that narcissism is in everyone to some extent. It's just to what extent do we use it, and is it a codified defense strategy rather than something that occasionally comes up. But my first book, the whole premise of it is that everyone is a little bit narcissistic, and so being able to recognize it in yourself, to whatever extent it shows up, is the first step. So that's what I would say the first kind of misunderstanding is for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does mislabeling narcissism actually delay healing?
Yeah, I think for the narcissists themselves, I've worked with narcissistic people who have discovered they were narcissistic. It's not very common that narcissists will um, you know, seek out help for their narcissistic traits because they typically don't think much is wrong with them. But those who have, just like anyone else, it's really the first step to opening up um, deeper dimensions within themselves, because narcissism is such a strong defense strategy. Recognizing it in oneself or in someone else can really, once you know what you're dealing with, you know how to work with it, right? And so I think naming something, um, whether it's in yourself or someone else, is the first step to healing. Because if you don't know what you're healing, you don't know what medicine to prescribe, right? And I think that it's important, not to reduce people to labels, whether yourself or someone else, whether it's you or someone else that may be struggling with narcissistic traits, but to recognize what it is, to name it, so that it can be healed. That's the first step in healing for anything, in my opinion.
Yes, and that reframes recovery as curiosity and not condemnation.
Yes, exactly. Yes, being curious about what's happening, um, with others and yourself, which is why I think it's important for people to learn about, especially if you suspect someone in your life might be narcissistic, to really learn what it is, and how it works and where it comes from, and then of course always to remember to keep the human part of the label, as it were, in the equation, and not to dehumanize someone who's narcissistic, because I think that can happen as well.
Yes, totally. And spiritual narcissism can hide behind good intentions. How does it subtly show up in spiritual spaces?
Yeah, I think there are certain variations of narcissism, and I talk about these both in my book, The Narcissist in You and Everyone Else, and Center of the Universe. Um, and in Center of the Universe, I have a whole case study of a guy named Joe, who is a composite of different case studies, but is a what some might call a spiritual narcissist. It's the dark empath, and and so it's, yes, typically we define narcissism as someone who has significant empathy deficits and a tendency to exploit others, um, to, be grandiose and often overconfident, and to deprioritize others' needs and overly prioritize their own needs, often to their own relational detriment. So that happens with all narcissists, but with the dark empath subvariant, they, narcissists actually do have, many of them have a lot of cognitive empathy where they can understand where people are coming from. Um, and if employed in spiritual settings or therapeutic settings, the ability to understand others really can kind of um, help them to bolster themselves or to control people or to control outcomes, because they can predict what others' needs are, and they can shape shift themselves into the wise spiritual mentor, or the empathetic counselor, or um all of those kind of variations on the helper role, which is what I see oftentimes in spiritual positions of authority. And so the dark empath can be really kind of one of the more their their damage can be a little bit more insidious, because they often mix with a lot of sort of psychopathic traits that can make them exploitative, and it can be really dangerous in certain settings, um, that that where people sort of encounter them and think that they're really kind and loving, and oftentimes they will have a lot of spiritual insight or psychological insight, but it's used for the wrong aims.
Yes, definitely. And why is self awareness harder when ego disguises itself as enlightenment?
Yeah, I think that, again, going back to that, um, I think that a lot of spiritual narcissistic people can be spiritual, just like anyone else, right? And I think that, when narcissism and a propensity towards spiritual knowledge or understanding mix together, um, it can be easy for the narcissist to believe that they've reached levels of consciousness, maybe that have far outpaced, where they actually are. Or, and this is sort of a controversial um, sort of take, but I've seen it. I've met people that were narcissistic and also very spiritually advanced. So narcissism doesn't necessarily mean that because narcissism is a personality, uh, is a personality defense strategy, that works on a psychological level. And then I see the spiritual domain as sort of intertwining with, of course, the psychology and the psychological level. But I think being able to access deeper or higher levels of understanding or wisdom or guidance, I don't think that that necessarily is blocked by someone's narcissism or any other psychological trait. I think you can be, which is why it's important to work on both your psychology and your spiritual advancement at the same time. They have to go hand in hand. But I've seen people who are spiritually, um, really are tapped into something, really do have a lot of wisdom, a certain level of spiritual advancement, that other people might recognize as, fairly enlightened, right? But in their personal lives, when they walk away from that, they can't hold the presence, or they haven't worked on their personality defense strategies in such a way that allows them to uh, sort of break down those defenses, because of course for narcissists the fear is of being vulnerable. And so if you have a fear of being vulnerable, then yes, there is a way in which um, certain levels of spiritual guidance or awareness do have trouble infiltrating the self, because you're guarded against it. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think someone can be really spiritually advanced in a lot of ways and still struggle with narcissistic traits. And so I always teach in my work that it's important to work on both the psychology and the spiritual advancement at the same time, because if you don't, you can get someone that can yield their spiritual wisdom in dangerous ways, right? They can use their guidance and wisdom and access to something deeper and wider, and use that insight in ways that maybe aren't as healthy, and therefore have a bigger impact on people because of that wisdom and insight.
Yes. And this also challenges the assumption that spirituality automatically equals humility.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. I think for some people that where narcissism isn't the primary defense strategy that's used, I think that spiritual wisdom and insight often does accompany um, sort of humility, like you said. But I think in the narcissist, it's oftentimes that kind of wisdom is used to bolster the grandiosity, right? Only I have access to this realm and I have the guidance and I can show people and tell people the way, right? And there can be a narrowing to some extent of their perspective because it's centralized in them rather than in something larger, except when they're tapped into that larger thing. So I've seen people go in and out of that, right? Where there's humility when they're um present, right? And they are able to be present and in the moment, and access whatever they're accessing. And then when the further out they get from that presence, the more, the less that humility is there, and it starts to fade.
Yes, 100%. And you've said narcissism can inspire spiritual deepening. How can something so painful become transformational?
Yeah, I think for the people who are victims of narcissistic abuse, it can definitely spurn you towards spiritual awakening. I think going through um, a difficult or abusive or traumatic relationship with a narcissist uh, can, if leveraged, with by getting the right help and understanding the narcissistic abuse cycle and all of that, can really help someone to um, reach towards their own healing and sort of seek to understand what about them was attracted to the narcissist and what they learned from the narcissistic relationship. And I think all of those questions that come up, during or after a narcissistic relationship can really be um, integral in helping someone to deepen their own practice, whatever that is, right? And look within themselves, and then also hopefully eventually to find some compassion for the narcissistic person. That doesn't mean you have to forgive everything they did, but recognizing their humanity, and I think that deepens their spiritual journey, or can. And then I think for the narcissist, if there's recognition that those traits are there and that they can come up and why they come up and the situations in which the person experiences narcissism and narcissistic flair, they'll find that it's that guarding against vulnerability. And um, I think that if the narcissistic person can name it, be radically honest about what it is that is happening in them and why they need to feel superior or have a one up on other people, or all the things that go along with narcissism, right? I think it's important for them to recognize it, because there can be a way to move past that. It doesn't mean that those things won't come up. If someone is narcissistic, it just means that when they come up, there's enough distance between the ego defense strategy and the essence, the soul of the person. Um, and that distance can create greater presence. And once you create more and more distance between the sort of false self, which is, the ego, and with narcissism, the ego defenses have been, hardened like a shell, a hardened shell, it's like a knight wearing armor, and that armor gets soldered onto the person. But if you can create greater distance between the false self and the real self, to the point where you realize that the false self is just like clothes, right? That you put on, just like, our bodies. And that the soul, the essence of what is sort of behind all of that, is unscathed, right? There's no, um, narcissism isn't you know, isn't a disease of the soul, right? It's a defense strategy of the personality, of the ego structure. And so I think if they can realize that, it really can deepen their own spiritual journey.
Yes, for sure. And what inner shifts allow someone to move from self protection to self transcendence?
Yeah. I think that, um, w- again, awareness of one's patterns are the first thing that in my work that I try to facilitate with people is once you know what your patterns are, once you know what your defense strategies are, how they're triggered, what comes up, where they come from, that knowledge can help you to move into beginning to shift or change those patterns. I think it's difficult to change patterns, or loosen defense strategies that you're not aware of, right? And so part of awareness is recognizing what's happening in the self. And there's always a risk for people, especially spiritual people or people that are inclined towards spirituality, towards spiritual bypassing. And if you bypass your psychology and move straight into doing, um, spiritual, high spiritual work, or working with different energies, or even just, bypassing everything into like moving into presence. I think that that's noble. But I also think that I've seen it time and time again that the personality and its various defense strategies, whether you're a narcissist or not, will continue to hijack those experiences, and make them part of the ego. So it's important for, in my opinion, for people to recognize the patterns first, um, while doing their spiritual practice or spiritual work, or learning about, the spiritual world or their inner world. And then those gifts, spiritual gifts, spiritual understanding, wisdom, begin to shine through more easily because they are unobstructed or become less obstructed by the personality structure. And, even enlightened beings have retain many of their preferences. A lot of the defense strategies are gone. The triggers, may not be as strong, or they're able to see and sort of laugh at, or treat the defense strategies like a child, because they are childlike. They come from a young place. And but it doesn't mean that they disappear entirely, right? I think in order to be on the planet, um, as a human being, you have to retain some of those strategies as a way of being here, right? As sort of karmic, um, debt, right? In order to be in a body. But I think that, but gaining greater awareness of what the difference is, right? And not mistaking the false self for the real self. And I think that's, once you learn what those things are, you can start to make those shifts into a deeper relationship with the inner self.
Yes, and that also suggests breakdowns may be invitation rather than failures.
Exactly. Right. Yes. Looking at, seeing all of those things as, the things that come up in our lives, that trigger us, or where we've behaved badly, or, where we've treated other people poorly, as invitations to look deeper as to what made us do that and why. Correcting the behavior, of course, especially if it's, transgressive to someone else, is important, but correcting the behavior without understanding where it came from or why it was triggered is important. And vice versa, you can't just know why it was triggered and understand, I've met people that have lots of deep self-understanding, but then don't change their behaviors, they excuse their behavior. So it can't be either or. They both have to be happening. There has to be change, in the way that we behave, whether to ourselves or others. and also awareness, and they both go hand in hand.
Yeah, makes sense. And from an empathy perspective, what's the cost of avoiding our own narcissistic tendencies?
Yeah, I think the if we don't acknowledge our own narcissistic tendencies, you risk seeing it everywhere without recognizing it in yourself. And so there's a lot of projection that can happen, where um, and some of this is a normal part of understanding narcissism, where you start to um, well, I always tell people, the people that are afraid that they're narcissists themselves usually aren't. Um, and that's usually a good sign that you can see your own narcissistic traits, because many people with where narcissism is primary for them don't see that at the beginning. They have to be kind of led into that, or it's not that that information doesn't come easily. But I think if you can recognize it in yourself and how it shows up for you, and when you feel defended in a sort of selfish or narcissistic way, even if it's transitory, um, then you can have a little bit more empathy for people that are sort of always in that state. That doesn't mean we have to pity them, and it also doesn't mean that you have to excuse their behavior, and it also doesn't mean that you're going to be um, happy when they're doing those things, when they're in their narcissism. Uh, but but if you can see it in yourself and how it shows up for you, then you can at least um, empathize with them at a human level. For narcissists often um, very vulnerable, and even though they're guarding against vulnerability, they're very sensitive in a lot of ways. They tend to Research has shown that they tend to have pretty high levels of sensitivity, psychological sensitivity, which is why they develop such a strong armor against everything, right? And so I think being empathetic towards the sensitivity that's creating that kind of personality structure, and many narcissistic people say it's exhausting, right? Oh, those that are aware of it, how exhausted they are with the constant defending against vulnerability, and um, you know, feeling one down or less than, and all of those things that go along with the sense of inferiority that they have deep down, that it's exhausting to keep that up. And so I can have a lot of empathy for that, just knowing how tiring it must be, even if they're successful out in the world and make a lot of money or famous. Um, a lot of them, no matter what their position in life, say it's very exhausting to do that work. And so I think we can find empathy in that. And if you can find empathy for your own narcissistic, where narcissism shows up for you, because it depending on your personality type, um, we all have areas in our psyche that we defend more heavily than others. And having empathy for yourself then allows you to extend it to others.
Yes, and that also turns accountability into connection instead of shame.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. It makes it yeah, it allows us to connect with other people, and connect with um I keep going back to this because it allows us to connect with others' humanity. And if we're accountable to ourselves, then we can hold other people accountable for their behavior, and also have empathy for what's creating it. But like I said, it doesn't excuse or get anyone off the hook, and it doesn't mean you have to put up with negative or abusive behaviors. It just means that I love what you just said, that accountability becomes connection, and that's key.
Yes, absolutely. And healing doesn't begin by denying the ego. It begins by seeing it clearly. If this
Right.
conversation resonated, take a moment this week to observe where empathy is being replaced by self-protection. Awareness is not weakness, it's the starting point of real transformation.